Hello guys and welcome to this video. Today I'd like to talk about undervolting your CPU and why it is a great idea to actually do this if it's possible. Well, first of all you have to know that each CPU runs at different clock speeds. The higher the clock speed, the higher the voltage will be. Of course, it needs more cycles and therefore more power, so you need a higher voltage. It makes sense. Hopefully. So normally in a Windows PC, the system decides which clock speeds should be used. You can tweak this with the power settings in your system preferences. For example, battery saver mode or high performance mode. High performance mode will always use a really high clock speed in order to achieve more power. But of course, the power output or the power usage is also higher because it has more cycles that needs to be powered. So you also need to know that there's a process called binning, which means that each CPU is unique. You can have 10 different CPUs and still receive different results, or they're still not equal in a certain way. So you can have 10 i7 for example, 2 of them have a high binning, which means they can run at a low voltage, and the other ones are, well, they can run at the stock voltages, but you can't really undervolt them without a complete system crash or a CPU crash. Especially the K series are very high bin CPUs because they're intended for being used at higher clock speeds, because overclockers like to have more clock speeds of course, so you don't have to bump up the voltages too high and they're still running. So that's the thing behind binning. So the problem here is that each CPU is different and you don't know if your CPU is good at all. Really, you can't really say that. You only know that an i7 or a Xeon will be better, hopefully, than other ones, but of course there is no real way of telling that. So each CPU can be undervolted more or less depending on the binning. So what you can do on desktop PCs or laptops maybe even, especially on Android devices too, but that's another video for another time, you can undervolt your CPU in the settings or in the BIOS settings. Of course, this could lead to instability because at some point there could be a too low voltage to run the CPU at this clock speed, so it just crashes and your PC just shuts down and it's like no blue screen, nothing, it's just off. So you need to find out the perfect voltage or the perfect offset to do this. So there's an offset for the CPU voltage at a volt level. So you have, for example, 1 volt normally on a CPU, and you can undervolt by about 0.025. So in order to find out which voltages may be good for your CPU without a crash, of course, you have to try it. There's no real way of saying that this CPU is good or bad, or if it has a high binning or not. So you have to just test it or to try it in order to find out what's possible. Well, the easiest way is to go into your BIOS settings and search for CPU settings. Now there is an option which is called offset, and you can have a positive or a negative offset which will be applied to every voltage. You know, there are different voltages for different clock speeds, and the offset is just for every clock speed. So if a lower clock speed runs the low voltage, it will have this offset, or a higher voltage, for example, on a higher clock speed will have this offset. And for overclockers, a higher offset, so I mean a positive offset, is a great idea. And for undervolting, you have the opposite. You take a negative value. This value is normally assigned by volt, so you have about 1 volt. And of course at stock there is no offset, so it's 0. And now you have to tweak the millivolts, which means that you have to put it down at the beginning of 25 millivolts. So you enter 0.025. This is 25 millivolts. Then you run your system, for example, an hour or so. Don't do really important stuff because it could be that your PC just shuts down immediately. So don't do anything that is not stored immediately or in real time. Really be careful. And you can use Geekbench or Prime 95 to stress your CPU to push it to the limits. And if it's running stable for at least an hour, then you can pop it up by, let's say, about 5 millivolts. So your offset, your negative offset, will be 0.030, and you move on until you hit a critical value, which normally is about 100 millivolts, so 0.100. This is normally the max you can go, but of course it depends on the CPU. And if your CPU starts to crash, which will happen sooner or later, then you just bump it up by 5 millivolts again, so you go down with the offset. For example, we have 100 millivolts and it runs perfectly stable. And then there's 105 and suddenly it crashes. What are you going to do? You're going to use 100 because this works just fine without any disadvantages. So you just set that and you know what your CPU is capable of. You could undervolt about 100 millivolts. Again, this could be more or even a higher value or a lower value, depending on your CPU. For me, for example, I could undervolt by about 100 millivolts, or about 105, I think, on the Xeon 1231 V3, I think. Hopefully, I'm not quite sure, but I think that's my CPU. I should know that. And now you have successfully undervolted. So what are the benefits? I mean, why even bother undervolting? What advantages are there? Well, it's of course not a magic trick to boost your CPU and to suddenly give you extra performance. No, it is not. But the best thing is there are no disadvantages as long as your system runs stable and you have a lower power output. So for example, if you have an 80-watt CPU running at full speed and now maybe it doesn't draw 80 watts but only 75, for example. So a bit of power consumption will be reduced, which is great because again, no disadvantages, except that you have to know which offset to use. The next thing is temperature. Because you don't need as much voltage as before, the temperature will be quite lower. Of course not significantly. If your CPU runs at 70 degrees Celsius, for example, it won't be suddenly at 50 or something, or even replace a water cooler or a fan cooler. But of course it's a little bit. For example, 2 to 5 degrees are possible. I got about 3 to 4 degrees and it's better than nothing. I mean, I had 60 degrees Celsius at the beginning, and now at full speed in winter I have at about 57 degrees Celsius, and there are no disadvantages. I just had to try this out. Please notice that you have to know how to reset your BIOS, because it could be that you, for example, enter a wrong value of about, let's say, 1 volt. So an offset of 1 volt would mean that the CPU runs at about maybe 100 millivolts, which is definitely not enough, not even for the lowest clock speed. This will lead to a PC that can't be booted, not even into the BIOS, to reset everything. So you need to manually reset your BIOS by using a jumper and to reset the BIOS settings or the CMOS settings. If you don't know what this is, then please don't do this or don't try this because it's quite risky if you don't know what the hell you're doing. But if you know how to do this, and you can even Google this, then you're perfectly safe, because in the worst case scenario, you're at an offset of 0 again. So you can either try everything from scratch, or of course just don't care and you just leave it like it is because it was running perfectly. So hopefully I could help you and explain what undervolting is and why you can do this, and if you know what to do, you actually should do this. Of course, don't do this if you're an overclocker, because for overclocking you need a higher voltage, or at least a stock voltage, and I'm really sure that it won't work because too low voltages, it won't be stable and your system will crash immediately. So that sums it up. For discussions or your opinion on this topic, please leave a comment down below. Otherwise, we're done here for today. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you soon. Bye! Where the hell did I put my phone? Damn it! Well, never mind. Found it. Bye.